Hi, my name is Selina Champion-Shirley, and I'm currently a junior at Connecticut IB Academy. I've been a resident of Hartford for most of my life, and I'm an active participant in many community organizations like Speak Up with Connecticut Children's Advocacy and the Youth Leadership Academy with Hartford Communities That Care. Today, I'm interviewing State Treasurer Erick to learn more about what Connecticut is doing about economic disparities throughout our state. To begin, I'd like to ask, why did you want to become treasurer, Mr. Russell?
Sure, thank you for the question, and thank you for doing this interview. I think the reason I was interested in running for office was really that I could make a big difference. I was in private practice. I'd never thought that I would ever run for office or seek a political position. But I think what is important is that we need people from different backgrounds and perspectives and who have different experiences serving in these roles so that we can make sure we're bringing new ideas and policies to the table. And so with the role of treasurer, I did a lot of work in the finance space before I started. I represented the treasurer's office as a lawyer and thought that I could combine my professional experience with public service and really make some big things happen. I grew up in inner city New Haven without a lot of resources myself and wanted to make sure that we were thinking about economic policy and opportunities to really lift people up, right, and make sure that we're leveling the playing field. We have more people participating in the process, and I felt like the treasurer's office was a unique position for me to actually be able to do that from.
Yeah, that's a really interesting story. Moving on to the main questions, we'll start with the topic of baby bonds. How are you making sure the families who need baby bonds the most actually know that they are enrolled?
Sure, so a really important question. So with Connecticut baby bonds, enrollment is automatic. So as a child is born and if their birth is covered by Husky, the state's Medicaid, they automatically qualify for this $3,200 seed fund that we ultimately invest. What we're doing from there is we get information around who is born and who is eligible, and we're providing notification to those parents. So we actually send a letter to all of the parents who have a child who's born and is eligible. And the goal there is to make sure we're engaging with them, right? We want parents to know that their kid has this resource. We want kids as they're getting older to know that they have this access to capital, because the whole goal is that this is going to change behavior, right? People can see a future that's different for themselves when they know that they're going to have, just a little bit of an opportunity that they may not have had otherwise. And so we're doing a lot of communication with families. We have a portal where families are going to be able to sign up to communicate with regularly, to be able to ask questions. And then our goal is we're working with philanthropy to raise private dollars into the fund as well, so that we can have additional wraparound supports for the parents, so whether that's workforce development or financial education, but also for kids as they're growing up and getting older, ways that we can continue to communicate with them as well.
I think those are really good ideas, and it's really important for people to know about these opportunities to ensure that the program is fully utilized. My next question about baby bonds is, will the ongoing budget cuts at the federal level affect the funding for the program? And if so, what protection measures are being put in place to ensure that the bonds continue?
Really good question. So the way that we funded the program with baby bonds, we actually put funding in the trust that gives us at least 12 years of the program. So we're not going back to the budget every year to ask for those resources. That being said, we're definitely being impacted as a state by what's happening on the federal level, right? We're seeing cuts particularly that are targeting the most vulnerable communities, cuts to Medicaid, food assistance programs, housing assistance programs. And as a state, what we're trying to do is our best to make sure that we are protecting particularly the most vulnerable populations in our state. And so that is impacting our budget on a day-to-day basis and a year-to-year basis. And we're trying to maintain flexibility so that we can navigate what all of that looks like. And I will be going back to the legislature at some point to make sure that we have continuous funding for baby bonds, right? That's something we're going to be working on. I think our goal as a state is we've done a lot of work to improve our overall fiscal health. I think we're going to continue to do that, but also we're going to continue to look for ways to invest in people, right? And invest in policies that are about lifting people up and creating opportunity. I think we've done a good job about, striking that balance, but we're going to have to remain diligent about it, particularly with the challenges on the federal level.
That's amazing. Moving forward, my next topic is related to local investments. How can the state incentivize businesses to return to urban cores like Hartford to rebuild the tax base and provide living wage jobs for residents? And more importantly, what support is needed from locals?
So it's another really good question. I think when we look at bringing business into the state, I think we have to look at a lot of our big picture challenges. So I mentioned a lot of the work that's been done to improve our overall fiscal health. If you think about it in the state, we went 70 years without properly paying into our pension funds. And because of that, we had this really big hole that we've had to work our way out of. Because we weren't paying in, what we've had to do in recent years is put a lot of our general fund money that comes out of the budget to kind of make up for all of that lost time. And we're in a spot now where we have freed up hundreds of millions of dollars on an annual basis that we can get back out into the community. And we need to continue to do things like that. I think when you look at attracting business and you look at the fixed costs that we had, so the pension fund was a big piece of that. Yeah. When you look at the cost and the availability of housing is another big challenge, because even as we're trying to attract businesses to the state, those businesses need somewhere for their employees to live, right? And it needs to be places that they can actually afford. And so I think we're doing a lot of work to develop more housing, particularly affordable and workforce housing, to help really lower those costs and incentivize more people to come into the state. I think as you look at all of these things big picture, that work needs to continue, right? And we need to make, particularly for young people, make sure that the state is more affordable, where people can stay here and really build business up. And that leads to exactly what you're saying, right, is building that tax base, particularly in a lot of our cities. If you look at a city like New Haven, there's so much demand where I live, there's so much demand for coming in. We can't build enough housing fast enough. I think some of our other cities, there's more opportunity, where I think there needs to be more of that draw to pull people into town. And I think a lot of that is creating vibrant centers of our cities that really drive a lot of the work-life balance as well.
I agree. That's great. This is extremely related to my next question. How do you ensure that revitalizing a neighborhood through the Community Investment Fund doesn't end up pricing out the people that are currently living there?
Big challenge, right? And I think we're seeing this in a lot of communities, not just in Connecticut, but all across the country. As we build more housing, you have a lot of this luxury housing that's coming in, and what's happening is that people who have actually lived and worked and grown up in these neighborhoods are ultimately being pushed out. And so I think we need to strike the balance as we are building new housing. We need to make sure that we're building affordable housing. Again, workforce housing. I think we need to make sure that we're creating jobs in these areas that folks from and around the community can actually fill. And through CIF, the whole goal here is that we're investing in transformative projects across the state that are really going to drive more economic development, but a lot of them have housing components. They're multi-use projects that, again, as we're thinking about long-term in the state, is creating more growth. But I do think we need to make sure we're building housing that people can actually afford. And I think that's a big piece to this, is the affordable and workforce piece, not just luxury and high-end housing that is ultimately going to price working people out of it.
I think those are really good ideas to avoid gentrification while also improving living conditions for existing residents of these neighborhoods. Moving on, the next subject is about property tax reforms. Recently, House Republicans proposed an increase in property tax credit from $300 to $1,000 to combat rising housing costs. Would you support an increase in the state property tax to $1,000 and a higher income eligibility?
So I think I'm open to anything. I think what we need to do when we're talking about tax policy is be thinking bigger picture, right? And I think some of a proposal like that in the grand scheme of things is, I think we need to be looking at more comprehensive tax reform. We are a state that is very dependent on property taxes. We have 169 towns, right, in Connecticut that are all doing these things differently. And as we talked about with many of these other projects, I think one of the bigger challenges is that for cities like New Haven or Hartford or Bridgeport that are also housing a lot of the non-taxable property, but that so many people in our regions ultimately rely on, whether that's churches or museums, universities, right, hospitals, that are not paying property taxes into our communities, but that a lot of residents outside of our cities are ultimately benefiting from. We need to make sure that that is more equitable. And so as we talk about things like pilot and ways that funding goes into our cities, we need to make sure that that's actually meeting the moment and meeting the need. So I'm certainly open to the idea of higher tax credit policies, but I think what we need to be probably more focused on is how we're actually lowering property taxes across the board and making sure that, particularly in urban communities, that we don't have so much more burden that's put on those who are already struggling the most. Whereas in more affluent towns with people that have more resources, those property taxes are less of a concern.
I'm really glad you mentioned pilot, because that's related to my next question. If possible, what specific legislative steps could be taken for the pilot program to provide 100% reimbursement to Hartford?
So a lot of it is actually is that we should be fully funding pilot out of our budget. I think where the challenge has been goes back to a lot of what I said before, where we were in a position 10 years ago where as a state we were jumping from fiscal crisis to fiscal crisis. We didn't have the money to do this, right? And it's put a lot of our cities in a really difficult and challenging spot. And so I think, a lot of the work that's been done to correct those things has put us on a path where we can actually provide the funding that we should be through pilot. And we've seen that just through this last budget cycle, right, where there's been a few $100 million more that went to municipalities, that went to education, and that is because we've gotten our fiscal house in order. 10 years ago, we had no money in our rainy day fund. We, again, were not paying our pensions properly. We had incredibly high fixed costs. We did not have balanced budgets. I think when you put all of that together now and look at where we've come, it's putting us in a spot where we can really reinvest back into our communities, particularly into our cities, which are the economic drivers of the state.
I agree. Just to clarify, so you do think that it's possible for Pilot to provide 100% reimbursement to Hartford?
I think it is, but I also think that, again, a lot of this work is we are moving in that direction,
time,
right?
yeah.
Because we were in a spot where we didn't have the money to do it at all, right? Yeah. And I think we've seen more and more funding coming to our cities now that it's more closely aligned with Pilot, but I think our goal should 100% be to get to that 100% number to actually fund Pilot.
Great. Yeah. Moving on, the last topic of discussion is financial literacy. Since financial literacy is now a requirement to graduate, how do we make sure it covers things like the racial wealth gap and credit scores?
Yeah, so this has been a really big priority for me in thinking about financial literacy, and in large part is because I didn't have a lot of these skills or tools when I was coming up. My parents didn't have a lot of resources. They didn't have a lot of those skills themselves to pass down to me more organically. And so I think, like a lot of other people, I had to kind of learn the hard way. So it was either by kind of figuring it out as I went or by making mistakes, right? And then coming back and having to correct those things. And I think it's huge for us as a state that we now have this requirement, because I can tell you, as I'm out in schools meeting with students, the comptroller and I always do financial literacy jeopardy in schools across the state in April, and we see the difference between schools that now have this curriculum when they didn't have it before. And that's where we do a lot of the basics that are covered around credit scores and mortgages and credit cards and how to kind of different types of student loans. But I also think that, to your point around the racial disparities and wealth gaps, that those conversations need to happen, right? And I think we should be talking about those challenges in school. I think a lot of those things tie back to history when you look at policies that were implemented that created a lot of these disparities. And I think what's important about talking about it is that's ultimately how we're going to fix this problem too, right? Is that you have to be intentional about it and you have to understand how we landed here. And so while, I don't know that that's part of the curriculum now, I do think that these conversations are really important so that people can be more mindful about policy that we're implementing moving forward as well.
Yeah, I agree. The next question is, what are the specific goals of your new working group for financial literacy, and how will it make sure that the school curriculums address problems surrounding economic disparity?
Sure. So we aren't going to be the ones who ultimately set the curriculum or the policy for that. That will be ultimately through the State Board of Education. But what I've tried to do is just really use the office as a platform for advocating for this work, right? And really talking about how important it is. And so yes, on the financial education piece, we've been doing that, and we partner with a lot of whether it's the legislature, the governor's office, many of our agencies, as we're trying to move the ball. But it's also using my platform to try to think about policies that address disparity in the state. So when you look at a program like Connecticut Baby Bonds, that's about addressing wealth inequality, right? We're one of the wealthiest states in the country, but we have one of the largest wealth gaps. And so thinking about policy that's going to help move us in that direction. And then we're constantly looking at other ways to do that. I think as we have conversations around, I think about this as one of the first millennials elected to statewide office, the comptroller and I. Young people are in a tough spot, right? When you look at a lot of the federal policy that's taking place right now, whether it's student loans, right? Whether it's just an economic environment, whether it's the security of programs like Medicare or Social Security that have been around that prior generations have really been able to benefit from. I think younger folks in this country have question marks around, whether or not those things are going to be there for us, right? And so I think as we look at those disparities and wealth divide that continues to grow all across the board, we constantly have to be creative and think about how we're making these investments in the future to create more opportunity to lift people up. And so we're going to continue to do that work to try to find new ways to help bring this together. And I think all of the things that you're bringing up, which I think you have had incredible questions, are all many of the pieces, I think, to moving in that direction in the future.
Thanks. I think that was a wonderful ending to this interview. Thanks again for your time, Mr. Russell. This interview was very informative, and I can't wait to see how your work will help lower and middle income communities.
Thank you. I appreciate it, and look forward to doing some work with you, because you're clearly going to be in this for the long haul as well. So, thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah.